Chapter 7. The Patriarch and His Sons. After our last chapter, I'm sure we are ready to turn our eyes to the fulfilled promise of God, Isaac. The son whom God had promised to Abraham and Sarah was finally born. The name Isaac means laughter. Perhaps he was named after the joy he brought to the family. Isaac did not bring joy to his older brother Ishmael, however. When Isaac became old enough to have a wife, Abram sent his servant to the country where his extended family lived. He did not want Isaac to marry any of the women from the land where they had settled. God had the perfect wife for Isaac, and he sent her to meet the servant. Rebekah was very beautiful, and even better, she was a distant relative of Isaac, which was considered a good thing in those days. Rebekah agreed to come back to Isaac and become his wife. Isaac and Rebekah had twin sons named Esau and Jacob. These two may have been twins, but they could not have been more different. Esau, the older brother, was big and burly. He loved to go out in the wilderness and bring home all sorts of wild game. Isaac loved Esau and the meals of wild game he brought. Jacob had a different personality. He also had his mother's favor. As the younger of the twins, Jacob was not in line to receive the main portion of his father's blessing. This seemed to bother his mother, Rebekah, more than it did Jacob. She came up with this scheme to trick Isaac, who was quite old by this time, into giving Jacob the blessing. The trick worked, and Jacob received the blessing. He also received a shove out the door. Jacob had to run away from Esau. It would be a long time before Jacob would be able to return. Jacob wanted to honor his parents' wishes that their son would not marry a woman from the land of Canaan. Jacob met a beautiful woman named Rachel, who he desperately wanted to marry. There was one problem, however. Rachel's father was Laban, Jacob's uncle, and it seemed that scheming ran in the family. Laban told Jacob that he could marry Rachel if he worked for Laban for 7 years. Jacob should have been suspicious because Laban had a scheme. Jacob loved Rachel so much that he agreed to the 7 years of work. Finally, the time was over. The bride came in with the veil over her face, which in those days was not removed until after they said I do. When Jacob saw his bride for the first time, he was shocked. It was not Rachel. Back in that time in history, the older sisters always got married first. And unfortunately for Jacob, Rachel had an older sister named Leah. So Jacob worked another 7 years for Rachel. Now Jacob had 2 wives, and believe me, this caused him a lot of trouble. After many years, Jacob's family had grown, and he had become a wealthy man. Jacob decided to return to the land of his father and mother. He met up with Esau, who had married a woman from the house of Ishmael, and the 2 brothers worked out their differences. In Genesis 35:20 through 21, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. Israel, Jacob, would have 12 sons, and his children were a bit wild. In fact, they were quite a gang of unruly men. Rachel, who had given Israel 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, died in childbirth. Israel loved Rachel most and favored her children over the other sons. This caused a lot of discord between the other sons, who were jealous. Joseph made his brothers angry when he told them about his frequent dreams. These dreams always included imagery of the others bowing down to him. Of course, this made the older brothers boiling mad. One day, Israel gave Joseph a new coat. This was not just any coat, though. This coat was a masterpiece of color and fine fabric. Joseph was proud of his new garment and wore it when he went to check on his brothers, who were out in the fields. They saw him coming and saw his coat from a distance. By the time Joseph reached them, they were angry enough to kill him. God had his hand on Joseph, though, and in the end, they sold him to a caravan of Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. Israel was heartbroken when the brothers brought back Joseph's beautiful new coat drenched in blood, along with the tale of how a wild animal had killed Joseph. Little did he know that they had soaked the coat in goat's blood, and Joseph was on his way to Egypt as a slave. Has anything ever happened to you that made you wonder how good could possibly come from it? I'm sure Joseph's mind was in shock when he was led across the hot desert, further and further away from his home and closer to the unknown. Why had God allowed this to happen? What was going to happen next? Would he ever see his elderly father again? Would he ever see his home again? He had gone from being a favored son of a patriarch to a nameless slave boy in one fateful day. But God did have a plan for Joseph. As we learn in chapter 4, Egypt was an amazing civilization with a distinctly different culture than Joseph had ever seen. Upon his arrival in this strange foreign country, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's important officers. Over time, Joseph proved himself to be a trustworthy servant, and Potiphar promoted him to a place of great importance in his house and estate. This position was not to last long for Joseph, however, because Potiphar's wife lied about Joseph and he was thrown into prison. Can you imagine? As Joseph sat in prison, I'm sure he wondered at this sudden turn of events. What had he done to deserve such a fate? Had he not served God by being honorable and trustworthy in his position at Potiphar's house? Had he not made the most of his slavery? Joseph could have been bitter and angry, but instead he continued to be honorable and trustworthy. While Joseph was in prison, there were two other men, Pharaoh's butler and baker, who were incarcerated because Pharaoh was angry at them. These men grew to respect Joseph, even though they could not understand why he was so honorable. After all, he had done nothing to deserve his imprisonment. Joseph was respected by the prison guards and placed in a position of caring for the other prisoners. God showed Joseph his presence by helping him interpret dreams. Both the butler and the baker had dreams in which God gave Joseph the interpretation. The butler was released and the baker was killed, as their dreams had promised. Joseph asked the butler to remember him in prison, which the butler promised to do, and then promptly forgot. It wasn't until 2 years later, when Pharaoh had disturbing dreams that no one could interpret, that the butler remembered his promise to Joseph. It was at this time that God brought Joseph out of prison and gave him the meaning of Pharaoh's disturbing dreams. Joseph told Pharaoh the meaning of the dreams. Egypt would have 7 years of plenty. In these years, the crops would be bountiful and the land would be more fertile than usual. These would be prosperous years throughout the land. Following these 7 plentiful years, however, there would be 7 years of extreme want. A drought would make growing crops impossible. The land would dry up and the topsoil would blow in great dust storms. After Joseph told Pharaoh the meaning of his dreams, the grateful king ordered robes of fine linen and the king's very own ring to be placed on Joseph. Pharaoh also made Joseph second in command over the entire land of Egypt. Only Pharaoh himself was above him. Take the time now to read that amazing story in the Bible. That story is in Genesis 41, 1 through 57. As we will learn more in depth in the next chapter, Joseph was eventually reunited with his family. The scripture tells us that the Pharaoh of Joseph's day invited him to bring his father and brothers along with their families to live in Egypt, specifically in the fertile delta region of the Nile River called Goshen. There are many other ancient sources that confirm the presence of a large number of Semitic people living in Egypt during the time of Joseph and Moses. One artifact in particular, the Brooklyn Papyrus, is a ledger that lists 95 household servants. Of the names listed, more than half of the names show that they were descendants of Joseph's family. Another artifact, a mural in an ancient tomb, depicts Semitic traders in Egypt. This is the Beni Hassan mural, which was created around 1890 BC and discovered in the early 19th century.